Okay, now to put this more in perspective, joining us is Bruce Fein, a constitutional lawyer. He recently wrote a piece for The American Conservative titled Trump's Alarming Abuse of Executive Power. Bruce, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And the title speaks for itself, but in your article you wrote, in a kind of rough quote here, there may be a greater abuse of executive power privilege, but it doesn't readily come to mind. Well, Trump has had these kind of battles on and on again, and courts have weighed in on them, people have been critical of them, but he has always been able to rally that fervent base of his and get a dialogue going nationally. What's going to stop him from doing that again, even though, as that poll said, a majority of Americans are opposed to this?
Well, he may be successful politically, even though he loses legally. And if that's true, I think that's good for the American people. The reason why this particular case is so critical is it involves the power of the purse. It is perhaps the strongest power that Congress enjoys to check presidential excesses. If it wasn't for the power of the purse, we might still be fighting the Vietnam War. That was used to shut down our involvement after the President Nixon continued the war, even when the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was repealed. So this goes to the cornerstone of legislative control over the executive. And that's what makes this so unique. There have only been 2 prior cases in which the emergency declaration has been used to spend money. One was the run-up to the Persian Gulf War, which is a fluid situation in 1991 with what we call Bush 41. Right. And then in the aftermath of the 9/11 abominations, Bush 43 expended money, but Congress acquiesced. The president didn't go to Congress and ask for the money and get rebuffed over 6 months, even longer period of time. This situation is different because it is clear there was a debate, a face-off between the president and the power of the purse. He kept asking, I want the money, I want the money. Congress kept saying no. Not only does the House of Representatives, controlled by the Democrats, say no, but the Republican-controlled Senate said no. And even when you move back one Congress to 2014 to 2016, 2016 to 18, when Trump had a Republican Congress in both the House and the Senate, they still didn't vote any money. So this is as clear a collision as you can get between the president's attempt to spend money that the power of the purse in the Constitution gives only to Congress.
I think you've talked about one of his foils, basically, Nancy Pelosi, basically saying it is the legislative arm of the government that is responsible for passing measures of this. If you want to have a wall, bring it before the House, let's have hearings, let's move forward. How will the state's lawsuits perhaps dovetail into what she's been trying to do?
Well, I want to underscore just what you said. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 specifically says you can't spend money except pursuant to an appropriations passed by Congress. So this is as unambiguous as 35 years old being required to be present. This is not room for debate. Now, with regard to these particular lawsuits, it is true, in my judgment, that they were politically motivated. Only Democratic governors sued, and the injury is quite remote from traditional injuries that are required in order to bring the federal court system into play. That is, to argue that because there's an impact on a state's economy, you can walk into court is not something the Supreme Court has accepted in the past as giving standing. In my judgment, you're really going to get the collision when the Democratic-controlled House is going to sue, claiming it's our power that's been usurped, we should be the defenders, and they will. And there's precedent for that. The House of Representatives, controlled by Republicans under John Boehner, sued President Obama, saying, you're spending money under the Affordable Care Act that we didn't appropriate. They got standing, and they actually won the case in the lower court. So that is what I think is going to be the case that finally goes up the ladder, probably to the United States Supreme Court.
Well, let's talk about that, because in that news conference where he said, I didn't have to do this, I did it, which I'm sure he'd like to go back and take those words away. But let's also look at the fact he said we may lose in the Ninth Circuit, we may lose in the next appellate court, but then go to the U.S. Supreme Court, which he has packed with conservatives. What is going to stop that arm from approving what Trump wants to do?
Well, I think the Supreme Court is very independent. The history of the court is having appointees of a president vote against them on critical matters. It goes back to Harry Truman and the Korean War. He appointed Tom C. Clark, and then he got angry at Tom C. Clark. He said, you can't seize the steel mills. In the Nixon tapes case, all of Nixon's appointees voted against him. So here we have a situation where the president has appointed 2 of the 9 nominees. And if you look at the most recent decisions of the court this term, there have only been a handful. Chief Justice John Roberts has been voting with what colloquially is viewed as the liberal side of the court, and if you will. And that gives them, in my judgment, 5 votes if this case got there and it was really a test of loyalty to the president. Remember, Chief Justice John Roberts is not appointed by Mr. Trump, so what is his loyalty? And
hopefully to the law, right?
Yes, and I say just historically it has not been true that appointees of a president necessarily rubber stamp the president's decisions. They are independent for a reason. They have life tenure. The president can't do anything at all about them. And given the nature, say, of this case, the power of the purse, the central ability of Congress to weigh in against the executive, I think this is the worst circumstances for the president to prevail.
Bruce Fein, thanks very much for shedding some light on this. I'm sure we'll be talking about this for months to come.
Thank you.